Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. Folks, this will be the vital boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, as there really is a lot of news and information to get to before I may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, ladies and gentlemen, over the weekend we saw something unique happen. It occurred between an U.S. FA-18 Super Hornet and a Russian-made plane flown by the Syrian Air Force. Apparently, what had transpired during this kerfuffle was that the Russian-made craft flown by Syrian pilots was attempting to harass the so-called freedom fighters, or the rebels in that region of Syria that have allied themselves with the United States of America against the Islamofascist state barbarians. And as we all know, the tensions that are in that area and in that region stem from the fact that Russia has been a staunch ally of the Bashar al-Assad regime. And this is something that goes all the way back to that alleged Islamofascist spring or Arab Spring of 2011. We know that the response by the United States government at that time was one that did not play out for the best interests and for the hopes, dreams, and future aspirations of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, we the people of the United States. We know that it put the Islamic Brotherhood or the Muslim Brotherhood in power in many Islamic states. And we remember the whole thing that happened in Libya, in Libya, and also when the Mubarak regime was toppled as well. Essentially, Islamofascist radicalism swept the Middle East by storm, and that was one of the major criticisms that we had, and many had on the right, against the disastrous debacle and fiasco of a regime known as the Barack Hussein Obama regime. Well, here we are, some 6 years later, and tensions are building between the two former Cold War juggernauts that had stared each other down since the cessation of hostilities of the Second World War, leading to what can only be called a chapter out of the Cold War. It's as though we have slid backwards in our foreign relations with the Russian juggernaut, and of course, this makes sense. We know that Russian strongman, autocrat, and dictator Vladimir Putin has wanted to be able to flex his muscles within the geopolitical theater. He has wanted to challenge the United States because he has essentially viewed the outcome of the um, Cold War as one that got rid of the honor of Russia, one that harmed the honor of Russia, and he's wanting to recapture that. He's wanting to go back to what he has deemed the glory days of the Cold War, and the United States is slowly inching its way back into being in a position of challenging Russian authority. But in order to do that, we have to be ready, willing, and able to admit that Russia is not that great of an ally. But when we look at the footing of the 45th presidential administration of these United States of America, the last thing they want to do is to be able to challenge Russia as we had at the height of the 1980s, what finally brought the evil empire, as Ronald Reagan so aptly put it, down. And you see, that's where we find ourselves today. We have a very confused foreign policy, which, yes, has been greatly exacerbated and worsened by the failings of the Barack Hussein Obama regime and his disastrous 2 terms in office. But it's also confused by the current stance taken by the leadership of these United States of America. We cannot sit idly by and allow Russia to thumb its nose at us. And unfortunately, what we see coming in the wake of this first aerial combat, air-to-air strike, basically, since 1999 in Kosovo, is that Russia has come forth and has proclaimed that they are now going to take a hostile stance towards any American flying object over Syrian airspace. This is a heightening of tensions. And once again, Russia has assumed the position of aggressor. Russia is attempting to threaten the true interests of the United States of America, both as a nation and people. Therefore, all of this clamoring to try and improve relations with the frozen giant of the Caucasus and Ural Mountains must come to a swift and immediate end. We have to stop wearing the rose-colored glasses in believing that Russia and the United States necessarily have shared interests. Because the fact of the matter is that when you stop and think about it, and when you look over the course of the past half century of history, Russia and the United States have been nemesis. We have been at each other's throats. And it's also important to recall that Vladimir Putin is a former leader of the KGB, that vast Russian intelligence network and cauldron that was diametrically opposed to the interests of the United States. And again, when we stop and recall that Russia has always, throughout its long history, been an agent provocateur of chaos, in that they view chaos as something that provides them with a modicum of security, a modicum of safety, then it's important to recall that no, our interests cannot line up. They cannot coalesce. Chaos is something that Russia has embraced going back to the time of Tsar Ivan the Terrible, back in the medieval period. When you have such a long and drawn-out tradition of being advocates, and dare I say, zealous advocates for chaos, it's important to recall that that goes against what the United States has always stood for. We here, in the land of the free and the home of the brave, have always stood for the natural order of things, or, in other words, the natural law tenets. You see, Russia doesn't believe in that. To them, chaos is what matters. Chaos is everything. That is what the Kremlin marches for. And the banner under which it has advanced its philosophies and ideologies since the time of the czars. That's something that cannot be ignored, nor is it something that can be swept under the rug. And just because we have a neophyte in the highest office in the land, I sure hope that Trump will take the stance necessary to secure the interests of the United States. It's as my first officer, Jeremy Grabenton, and I have oft-times reiterated on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, that Russia is not our friend, nor do we want to see the 45th president of these United States of America fail, because that means that the nation would fail. No one in their right mind would desire that, because it would be calamitous. It would have a clearly detrimental impact on the hopes, dreams, and future aspirations of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, we the people of these United States of America. And I do not believe, particularly at this turbulent juncture in our nation's relatively brief yet illustrious history here on the face of God's green earth, that we can afford to allow that to come into fruition. But what we see is that there was a fight, that Russia has taken acceptance to our standing up for our allies, and that has caused things to deteriorate. It has caused tensions to ratchet up beyond the stratosphere, and we do stand at the brink of this becoming a much larger conflagration of hostility. Now, the question is whether cooler heads will prevail here. I'm not entirely certain. We know that Russia has been itching for war. We've seen what they've done in the Crimea. We see how they have been agent provocateurs of destabilizing forces in regions throughout the world since the time of the USSR. And when we recall that this was the position and that this was the environment in which Vladimir Putin was reared and raised, it makes sense that he would embrace that. But we cannot look at this with naivety and believe that the interests of the Russian Federation and the American Republic necessarily converge. Yes, the Chechenian issue over there in Russia with Islamofascists coming out of their ranks is something that cannot be ignored. But that in and of itself, I do not believe will be enough to secure an alliance with us. Certainly, it would be a tenuous one at best. And it harkens back to the alliance that the United States had with the Soviet Union at the height of the dark and twisted conflict known as the Second World War. The only reason that Joseph Stalin, the horrific dictator of the Soviet Union, found himself in alliance with Great Britain and the United States was because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But we know that during that conflict, even though we were professed allies, the Russians were working to subvert our stance, to subvert the things that we had been so diligently working towards and the end goals that we had set for ourselves in World War II. And part of that had to do with the hysteria and the paranoia that gripped and ruled the heart, soul, and mind of the Russian dictator there in Joseph Stalin. But it also had to do with the fact that the communist system was diametrically opposed to the systems of freedom and liberty that were championed by the Western allies. That is something that cannot be ignored. Yet we know that historical revisionists, particularly those within the rank and file of the so-called alt-right or alternative right, don't want us to believe that. They believe that this is coalescing with and coinciding with and supporting their tribalist view of the American national heritage, character, spirit, but above all, identity. And again, it completely stands in staunch and stark opposition to that old adage that the United States is a nation of laws and not of men. In other words, that we in these United States of America have chosen, quite purposefully, to unify around a system of law, not a tribal identity, not even a language, not even a prescribed culture other than the one that arises from the supreme law of the land, which, pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2, what is known in the common American vernacular as the Supremacy Clause, is none other than our shared United States Constitution. So, yes, what happened over this weekend is one of those turning points in history. It is a time and occurrence where we in these United States must either make a decision that we cannot back away from. And if we don't, it means that our interests in the region, our hegemony in the geopolitical sphere will be challenged, and that we will not easily be able to regain our footing. Now, yes, I know that since he assumed the highest office in the land, that Donald Trump has been doing everything he can to repair relations with Russia. He has sat there and claimed that the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists, and not without good reason, have been attempting to make some sort of a mountain out of a molehill. But there are certain things that cannot be ignored with respect to what's been going on. The fact that Michael Flynn was forced to step down, even if it is subterfuge, when we are now facing heightened tensions with Russia, is something that must be revisited. It is something that must be addressed. And the sooner that we address it, the better able we will be to ensure that we take the stances that are necessary against those opponents of freedom, liberty, justice, and a true sense of equality. And what I mean by a true sense of equality is not that of equal outcomes, but of equal opportunity. You see, these are the things that we as a nation and people have been dedicated to since the inception of this nation some 237 plus years ago. It coincides with the foundational image that our founding fathers had set to paper at the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 when they drafted the supreme law of the land, our shared United States Constitution. You see, ladies and gentlemen, what it all boils down to is that we in the United States have got to get a clear grasp on our national heritage, character, spirit, but above all, identity, both as a nation and people. We have got to get clear with it. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to set clear, ascertainable goals for ourselves, and it means that we're going to be putting our servicemen and women in harm's way without a clear-cut goal for victory. And unfortunately, this is something that has hampered the United States since the Vietnam War. It's something that has come to the epicenter time and again, and unfortunately, it shows no signs of improving within the foreseeable future. I wish this weren't the case. I wish that I had words of comfort and solace to convey as I sit here speaking into this microphone, delivering this message unto you, our cherished listening passengers and audience members, yet no such words of comfort or solace reach the surface. Because of the confused leadership that we have, because of the seemingly, unresolvable contradictions that exist within American foreign policy right now, it's going to be nigh impossible to set things straight, to get a clear picture of what we need to do. And one of the things that also comes to the surface with this is that we know that those who have been the loudest surrogates and acolytes of the 45th president of these United States of America have attempted to say that, look, Russia and the United States have a vested interest in obliterating and annihilating the Islamofascist state. But recall, as I stated on the first segment of today's program, and as we have so oft-times reiterated on previous episodes of our state-of-the-art radio program, Russia is an agent provocateur of chaos. They find comfort in chaos. They find relief in chaos. And therefore, if having Islamofascist state barbarians and terrorists continue to operate, spreading as much chaos as is humanly possible within the borders and confines of these United States of America, then they are not going to do everything within their power to see it wiped off the map. You see, to their mind, there is no perceivable benefit from doing that. It would not be putting their interests first, or at least it would not, to their mind, be putting their interests first. And of course, Vladimir Putin is always going to be one that attempts to put his interests above all else. He puts his interests above his own people, and he will put Russian interests above interests of the United States. There is no way around this. That has been the modus operandi of the Russian Federation, but before that, of the Soviet Union. They do not view themselves as the natural allies of the United States of America. They view us as decadent, weak, and ineffectual. And therefore, they will do anything to challenge the authority, to usurp the hegemony of the United States with all, within the arena of geopolitics. And that's what Putin is dedicated to. That is what Putin has done time and again. And as we sit here looking at the proclamation that was made by the Russian Federation with respect to Syrian airspace, threatening to shoot down any United States aircraft, drones, or flying objects within said airspace, that is a deliberate heightening of tensions. That is a deliberate act of hostility against the hegemony of the United States. And remember, folks, that one of the things that Jeremy said on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, was that the Russian Federation would attempt to challenge the authority and the strength and the moral turpitude of Donald Trump. Here it is. This is the litmus test. And I am not so certain I am confident that Trump will pass the test. I hope so. I do know that Trump has a pattern within his behavior, an undeniable pattern, that if anyone challenges him, he then goes on the warpath against them. But is that necessarily in the best interests of the United States? I think so, as long as it is a defensive stance that we take. It is not an easy situation or scenario that we find ourselves in this morning. It means that, first of all, for the first time in, well, I guess 1999, that'd make it what, about 18 years, there has been aerial conflict, air-to-air conflict between a United States naval jet and the jet of a foreign power. And the other thing that we have to stop and keep in mind is with the notion and the claims made that Russia has a vested interest in obliterating the Islamofascist state, recall that they had supplied many of the nations in the Middle East to try and spread as much chaos as possible. They wanted to set up Soviet satellite states there. That's what the Russo-Afghani War of the 1980s was all about. And that's when we in the United States sat there and armed the so-called Mujahideen with some of the most technologically advanced weapons, such as the Stinger missile. Yes, these little satellite conflicts allowed the rise of nefarious, barbaric groups such as the Islamofascist state. The history is clear. And those who fail to learn from the mistakes of the past are, by and large, doomed to repeat history. It won't exactly play out in the same fashion that it did initially, but stop and think about it. We did face Russian armed Middle Eastern forces. In all of the wars that Egypt had to face in 1967, and the Yom Kippur War, and all of those wars since its formation in 1948 as an independent state, they were facing Arabic forces armed with Soviet weapons, tanks, and aircraft. That has not changed. That is where it is now. We fully realize that this aircraft that was shot down by the FA-18 Super Hornet was a Russian-built aircraft. That's something that is majorly important. And when we think about it, it really is a return to the height of the Cold War, and it's something that has been brewing for a while and shows no signs of improving within the foreseeable future. And so when we look at there was this post or article published in the Washington Post, and it says that U.S. aircraft shoots down a Syrian government jet over northern Syria, Pentagon says. This was by Thomas Gibbons Neff and Kareem Fahim, and it was published on June 18th, yesterday, at 6:21 p.m. And it essentially starts off with a U.S. strike aircraft shot down a Syrian government fighter jet Sunday shortly after the Syrians bombed U.S.-backed fighters in northern Syria, the Pentagon said in a statement. So already we see the type of proxy wars that we saw at the height of the Cold War drawing us in. Satellite conflicts in which the two major superpowers in the world were dancing in the conflagration of malice, death, depravity, and destruction. The Washington Post then goes on to state that the Pentagon said that the downing of the aircraft came hours after Syrian loyalist forces attacked U.S.-backed fighters known as the Syrian Democratic Forces in the village of Jadin, southwest of Raqqa. The rare attack was the first time a U.S. jet has shot down a manned, hostile aircraft in more than a decade, and it signaled the United States' sharply intensifying role in Syria's war. Now, folks, the question is, are these Syrian Democratic Forces really the people they claim to be? Or are we setting ourselves up to empower the Islamofascist state? Now, granted, these people are claiming to be fighting the Islamofascist barbarians, but it is not so clear-cut and black and white, particularly in that destabilized region and war-torn region of the world. It goes on to say at the Washington Post that the incident is the fourth time within a month that the U.S. military has attacked pro-Syrian government forces. Now, as we know, Russia has solidly placed themselves in allegiance and alliance with the Syrian strongman, autocrat, and dictator Bashar al-Assad. And that, too, is something that is not going to change within the foreseeable future. That is why we see the saber rattling on the part of the Russian Federation, warning the United States. This is like Khrushchev coming to the United Nations Security Council, banging his shoe on the desk, claiming, "We will bury you." See? We are returning to a time of mutually assured destruction. And if we are ill-equipped and ill-prepared to deal with the ramifications that will consequently arise therefrom, we are in for a very dark chapter in our nation's relatively brief yet illustrious history here on the face of God's green earth. And here is something else. A statement distributed by the Syrian military said the aircraft's lone pilot was killed in the attack and that the jet was carrying out a mission against the Islamic State. So there, the propagandist narrative and agenda has already been put into spin drive. Quote, "The attack stresses coordination between the U.S. and ISIS, and it reveals the evil intentions of the U.S. in administrating terrorism and investing it to pass the U.S. Zionist project in the region," the Syrian statement said, using an acronym for the Islamofascist state. So you see, already they're trying to make it as some sort of Jewish-backed conspiracy against the Islamic world. This is the same drivel that the Islamofascist barbarians use, and again, we must be resolute in our responses, and we cannot turn a blind eye to Russia's continuing support of this. Again, what it clearly demonstrates is that the Russian autocrat and strongman, as well as dictator Vladimir Putin, is no friend of the United States. He has ulterior motives. And those motives are to spread as much chaos as is humanly possible. That has been the modus operandi, again, of Russia since the time of the czars. This is not something that will change. Irrespective of how much the 45th president of these United States of America and his administration hopes and dreams and wishes for it to change, it is simply not going to change. The article goes on. It says, before it downed the Syrian plane, the U.S. military used a deconfliction channel to communicate with Russia, Syria's main ally, to prevent the situation from escalating, the Pentagon said. While that was the right step to take, I don't believe that that is the resultant outcome. I believe that tensions are ratcheting up in the region and that relations between the Russian Federation and these United States of America are continuing to deteriorate at breakneck speed. And if we are not going to open our eyes to this, if we are not going to admit the gravity of the situation, things are going to spin out of control and very rapidly. The article then goes on to say that U.S.-led jets stopped the fighting by flying close to the ground at a low speed in what is called a show of force, the Pentagon said. About 2 hours later, despite the calls to stand down and the U.S. presence overhead, a Syrian Su-22 jet attacked the Syrian Democratic Forces, dropping an unknown number of munitions on the U.S.-backed force. Colonel John Thomas, a spokesman for the United States Central Command, said that the Syrian aircraft arrived with little warning and that U.S. aircraft nearby tried to hail the Syrian jet after it had dropped its bombs. Thomas also said U.S. forces were in the area but were not directly threatened. It doesn't matter. This was a flagrant act of hostility, one that could seriously jeopardize the interests of the United States in the region, and it was right for us to take that stance. But we have to be prepared for the consequences, and we have to be prepared to take the stance that is necessary to continue to secure American interests within that destabilized region of the world. It goes on to say that after the hailing attempts, a U.S. F-A-18 Super Hornet shot down the Syrian aircraft in accordance with the rules of engagement and in collective self-defense of coalition-partnered forces, the Pentagon said. Thomas rejected the Syrian government's claims that the aircraft was bombing the Islamic State, adding that Jadin is controlled by Syrian Democratic Forces and that the militant group had not been in the area for some time. Meaning, of course, the Islamofascist barbarians. And what it comes down to is that the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces are a coalition of predominantly Arab and Kurdish fighters and serve as a key proxy force for the US-led coalition in Syria. The fighters were instrumental in retaking towns and villages from the Islamofascist barbarians in recent months and are fighting to retake the group's de facto capital of Raqqa. But remember that the interests of Russia here are in direct conflict with American interests, because Putin's buddy is the Syrian autocrat and strongman and dictator Bashar al-Assad. So again, they're going to view this as heightened tensions. And as of today, we know that Russia has come forth with the statement that they will down any American aircraft, be they drone or manned, if they are over Syrian airspace. Folks, that is an attempt to gain hegemony in the region. This is Russia flexing its proverbial muscles and attempting to undermine the national security interests of these United States of America. And again, remember when I said at the opening of today's Solo Flight Special Edition of our state-of-the-art radio program that Russia has always been a zealous advocate of the forces of chaos and that they would use this and claim that they were fighting Islamofascists, or that they wouldn't really fight Islamofascists if they believed in their heart of hearts that it helped their position, they'd do that. Well, that is what is playing out here. Of course, Russia is attempting to play a game of plausible deniability here. But that laughable notion from the Syrian statement that the United States is in cahoots with Islamofascist state, that is ridiculous. It is beyond the pale. It is disgusting. But that is the sort of dark and twisted machinations and notions that we are facing in that destabilized region of the world. What also happened on Sunday is that Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that it had launched a rare cross-border missile strike against Islamic State militants in eastern Syria. The missile strikes launched from Iran were in retaliation for twin Islamofascist state attacks earlier this month in Tehran on the parliament and the tomb of the leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini's little grave there, I guess, and it had killed 18 people. At least according to Iran's news agency, so we take that with a grain of salt. The missile attacks had targeted a militant command center, and other facilities in Deir ez-Zor, a contested region in eastern Syria where the United States, Iran, and other powers and proxy forces are fighting for control. So this is a power vacuum that was started by Obama's failed policy of leading from his behind, and it has led to even greater destabilization within the region and even greater risks to American hegemony within the geopolitical sphere. We have to be strong and resolute. The strikes had killed, quote, a large number of militants and destroyed equipment and weapons, a statement had said. So again, all of this plays out in a way that does not really coincide with the hopes, dreams, and dare I say, future aspirations of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, we the people. Rather, it is something that continues the destabilization in the region, continues to challenge and threatens America's hegemony, and we need to have a clear and resolute goal to protect American interests within the regions and indeed throughout the world. The Post goes on to say that earlier this month, a U.S. jet downed a pro-Syrian government drone that dropped an apparent dud munition near U.S.-led coalition forces near the southern Syrian town of At-Tanf, and that U.S.-led forces have increased their presence in Tanf to deter pro-Syrian government forces in the area. Iran-backed Shia militias, along with other pro-Syrian government forces, have steadily advanced around At-Tanf, despite repeated warnings from the U.S. military. So again, they already are not viewing us as a serious presence. They are questioning our resolve, and this is due partially to a fragmented, conflicting message and signal that is sent out by the leadership of these United States of America. I wish that weren't the case, but it is. When we look at the great weight of the evidence and under the totality of the circumstances with a modicum of objectivity, what other rational conclusion can one reach? It is the one inexorable conclusion that any sane, rational, logical, thinking human being could reach with a straight face. Tanf is a key town on the Iraq-Syrian border that has been home to a U.S. Special Operations training outpost for months. And the coalition's mission is to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria, is what the Pentagon has said. The coalition does not seek to fight the Syrian regime, Russia, or pro-regime forces partnered with them, but will not hesitate to defend coalition or partner forces from any threat. So they again are questioning our resolve. They are laughing at our willingness to fight, and they are testing the waters of our resolve within that destabilized region of the world. That is the harsh, stark reality that we must awaken to if we hope to secure the interests of the United States of America in that region and throughout the entire world. And unfortunately, it shows no signs of improving within the foreseeable future. So what will it mean? What does it mean that we are facing this? Well, it means that we are going to have to be clear with our intent, with our goal, and that we are going to have a well drawn out, thought out plan to deal with any contingencies that might arise in the region, particularly as we have increased our presence in said region. The other thing is, back on June 8th, we had shot down an Iranian-made drone in Syria. So none of this is going to resolve itself quickly. But what we do know is that in the immediate aftermath of this, Russia has begun to flex its muscles and threaten the United States. ABC News' Luis Martinez published today at 9:25 a.m. Eastern Time that Russia warns it will treat U.S.-led coalition jets in parts of Syria as targets after U.S. downed Syrian plane. So yes, folks, what is happening right now is that hostilities between the United States and Russia and Syria are heating up. It is contentious. It is heated. It is something that cannot be ignored. It says that the Russian defense minister blasted the U.S.'s shooting down of a Syrian regime fighter jet as a, quote, massive violation of international law, close quote, and said it will begin treating U.S.-led coalition jets flying west of the Euphrates River in Syria as targets. Well, no, actually, we had given a statement as per the rules of engagement. It is not our fault that these belligerent forces chose to disregard that, chose to place our people and our allies in dire jeopardy. It was an act of war. There is no other way to describe it. And if Russia continues to take this hostile stance towards us, there is no way that there can be any resetting of relations between the Russian Federation and these United States of America. Because right now, as it stands, by their own stance. They are assuming a position that is hostile and diametrically opposed to the true interests of these United States of America. There is no way around that, ladies and gentlemen. The ministry's comments Monday came after, of course, that U.S. Navy fighter jet on Sunday shot down the Syrian Su-22. And apparently, this Su fighter had dropped bombs on Syrian rebel forces who are fighting the Islamofascist barbarians in the country. So again, that whole narrative that has been reiterated time and again as to why we must strengthen our relations with Russia, even by President Trump himself, is beginning to fall flat. Again, Russia is an agent of chaos. They have embraced chaos. Chaos is what provides them with their strength and provides them with a sense of comfort. So again, this is not something that is going to play out in the best interests of the United States. It is not something that we can just treat in a loose-knit, willy-nilly fashion, because it is going to place our servicemen and women in dire jeopardy. And of course, this, as I mentioned before, was the first time the United States has engaged in air-to-air combat in Syria, signaling an escalation of the conflict. It is also the first time that any American aircraft has shot down any other country's aircraft in air-to-air combat since 1999 during the Kosovo air campaign, when a U.S. Air Force F-16 shot down a Serbian MiG-29. There again, the Russian involvement. There again, Russia supplying these satellite states a proxy war that is very reminiscent of the Cold War. So again, we have to ask ourselves how it is that we can claim that the interests of the United States and Russia can be mutually beneficial for one another when the United States stands and has always stood for the natural order of things, and Russia has been an agent provocateur of chaos. Now, folks, I'm not saying this as a form of fear-mongering. I'm not saying this as a way of belittling people who would want and desire a strengthened relationship between the Russian Federation and these United States of America, but I think that we have to look at it under the totality of the circumstances and with a modicum of objectivity. Otherwise, we're going to go in, grope around blindly, and shoot ourselves in the foot. And that is something that we can ill afford to do. But the other thing that comes out of this is that over the past 2 terms of the failed Barack Hussein Obama regime, our position within the region and indeed throughout the world has been significantly weakened. They question our resolve and our ability to stand and fight, and that is something that increases the danger tenfold. We mustn't allow them to think that they have carte blanche to challenge our hegemonic authority. So, contrary to what the Syrian statement said, which was already a laughable thing, talking about some sort of Zionist-led Illuminati-type conspiracy theory, where we had helped ISIS, or where we are in league with ISIS, no. We acted in self-defense. And we certainly acted in defense of others. And if Syria can't get that through its thick skull, then they will have another thing coming to them. Now, the last thing that I want to see come to fruition is a full-scale war. I do not want to see tensions between Russia and the United States heightened, but I also do not want to see American interests undermined within that destabilized region of the world. We have to act in our best interests. And that is going to require a steady foot. It is going to require an iron resolve. The Islamofascist state is a dire threat to all that we hold near and dear here in the land of the free and the home of the brave, and there is simply no way around that self-evident truth, ladies and gentlemen. Russia, which is backing the Syrian government regime and its civil war against rebel forces, slammed the U.S. action as a violation of Syria's sovereignty. Bovine excrement. If it was a violation of Syrian sovereignty, why is Syria using military aid from Russia? The Russian Defense Ministry put out a statement in which it said repeated combat actions by U.S. aviation under the cover of counterterrorism against lawful armed forces of a country that is a member of the United Nations are a massive violation of international law and de facto a military aggression against the Syrian Arab Republic. Oh, yeah? Except that when we put out statements in the region, do not approach here, do not attack here, that we had personnel in the region, while though not directly impacted or affected by it, any act against an ally of the United States is considered an act against the United States of America herself. That has been the rules of war for well over a century. The ministry also warned that any coalition aircraft flying west of the Euphrates will be tracked by the Russian ground and air anti-aircraft defense systems as air targets in the areas where Russian aviation is on combat missions in the Syrian sky. Russia, if you really want this to erupt into a full-blown war, you will make the Second Cold War go hot in the blink of an eye. Folks, this is dangerous. And it's time that we be wary. It's time that we put out a clear statement that any attack against the United States will be considered an act of war. Any attack against the allies of the United States will just barbarians that have engaged in a slew of terrorist attacks not only within the borders and confines of the United States, but also of Western Europe. It must stop. And Russia must not be an enabler of it. That is the message that President Trump should deliver. No more of this attempting to placate Russia. No more of this attempt of claiming that we need to improve relations with Russia. Russia needs to learn to respect our hegemonic position and to respect the interests of the United States. Then and only then will the relations between the Russian Federation and the American Republic be able to improve. Anything less than that would be undermining and usurping our authority. And again, that is simply something that we cannot afford to allow to come into fruition, particularly at this juncture of our nation's relatively brief yet illustrious history. There is simply no way around that, ladies and gentlemen. Sunday's downing of the Syrian jet occurred in an area southwest of the Euphrates River. And the U.S.-led coalition conducts missions in areas west of the Euphrates River near Manbij and Al-Bab, two towns retaken from ISIS by U.S.-backed rebel forces. You see, this is what Russia doesn't want to acknowledge. Why? Because Russia is in cahoots with the Bashar al-Assad regime, and they don't want these forces to have a claim of independence. It's much like how Stalin allowed the Nazis in Warsaw to destroy the free Polish forces because he saw them as a direct threat to his communist power grab. And remember that the entire impetus behind the European theater in the Second World War was Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. And yet, Poland came out of that completely consumed by the Iron Curtain. These things have been seen in history. History is a great teacher. It allows us to see the repetitive patterns, thereby empowering us with the capability of making reasonable and practicable predictions as to what will happen given a certain set of circumstances and facts as they stand on the ground. And that is certainly where we find ourselves right now. The Syrian Democratic Forces came under attack from regime forces in favor of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad around 4:30 p.m. Syrian time. A number of SDF fighters were wounded in the assault, and the SDF soon left Jadi, which means that this town was thereby left unguarded and open for the Islamofascist terrorists and barbarians to once again take control over this region after we had pushed them out. Again, that whole little narrative about Russia's interests coinciding with the United States against the Islamofascist barbarian terrorists falls apart. Because again, Russia is not operating by the same definitions that we are. And therefore, tensions in the regions will only continue to be ratcheted up, will only continue to deteriorate, will only continue to become more unstable, rather, unless we take a firm stance. Coalition aircraft conducted a show of force overhead that stopped the initial pro-regime advance towards the town. So again, there was an initial push that was then met with response that was even warned of by American and coalition forces should acts of hostility and aggression be taken in the region near where our forces and coalition forces and partners were located. Well, they backed down at that point. But then, at 6:43 p.m., a Syrian regime Su-22 dropped bombs near SDF fighters south of Tabaka, and in accordance with the rules of engagement and in collective self-defense of coalition-partnered forces, was immediately shot down by a U.S. FA-18E Super Hornet, said the statement. So again, America was acting in defense. The Syrian forces had already made a show of force, which was met. They backed off. But they questioned our resolve. And they decided to make yet another push. That is what pushed the envelope. If you do not adhere to the warnings that we gave, if you do not abide by the warnings that we gave, then you will be met with force. And the only ones who are to blame for that are those hostile forces that continue to act in an aggressive, hostile fashion. But that's not the way the Syrians nor the Russians are painting it. No, they're going forth with this cockamamie story that somehow the United States is in cahoots with ISIS. Why in the hell would we be in cahoots with ISIS? You know what that kind of reminds me of? It sort of reminds me of the way that Pol Pot of the Khmer Rouge used to capture people from Vietnam. Because the Vietnamese did not like the Cambodian regime, even though they were both communists, saying that they were a joint force of the United States Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, in Vietnam. This right after we had just finished that long, drawn-out conflict in Vietnam. It was laughable. Just as the claims of some sort of collusion between the United States and the Islamofascist state is laughable as well. It has no connotation nor any connection with reality. But that is what the agent provocateurs of tyranny, despotism, but above all oppression always do. They always attempt to obfuscate the truth. They always attempt to peddle a propagandist narrative and agenda in the hopes of bamboozling the people of the world. And you see, they are attempting to paint the United States as the villains. This is why we cannot just be so feckless. It's why we cannot be so nonchalant about claiming that we need to drastically improve relations with Russia to make them a key ally against ISIS. Well, if they are going to allow ISIS forces to retake a town in which the Islamofascist state had been ousted, they are certainly not strong allies. Rather, they are a belligerent force looking out for their own best interests, which are diametrically opposed to the national security interests and best interests of these United States of America. Folks, there really is no way around this simple fact. It should be open and obvious. The Syrian pilot is believed to have been able to eject from the aircraft, according to a U.S. official. However, the Syrians are claiming he was killed. Yet, the Russian Defense Ministry contradicted the coalition claim that the air safety hotline had been used and noted that there were Russian aircraft in the area when the Syrian plane was shot down. Again, this is an attempt to increase hostility. This is an attempt to challenge American authority and power within the direct region. Now, unless and until we are ready, willing, and able to take a more deliberate stance and to send a clear diplomatic message to the Russian Federation, these sorts of skirmishes will continue and they will be exacerbated with each successive passing day. The ministry said it would stop its participation in the deconfliction line, much as it did following American cruise missile strikes in Syria in April. But at that time, U.S. and Russian military forces continued use of the air safety hotline for Syria despite Russia's announcement that it would stop participating. Again, this is just to create as much mass chaos as is humanly possible. It is a predictable behavior pattern on the part of the Russian Federation that goes back to the time of the czars. Centuries worth of history tells us exactly how the Russians are going to react here. The Russians respect force. And so it was right to do a show of force, but now we need to back that up. Now we need to stop trying to placate Russia. We need to strengthen our sanctions against them, and we need to let them know that any belligerent act against the United States of America or her allies and coalition forces in the region will be construed as a direct attack on the United States. That would cause the Russian juggernaut to back down, just as it did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Jardin, where Sunday's incident occurred, is approximately 2 kilometers north of an established deconfliction area. The U.S.-led coalition, in its statement, stressed its goals in Syria and that it will defend its partnered forces. That is clearly within the rules of war. That is clearly in line with international law. And it completely contradicts the statements made by the Russian Federation and their Syrian ally. But again, what this all comes down to is it is an attempt by the Russian strongman, autocrat, and dictator Vladimir Putin to flex his muscles. He is wanting to see Russia rise as a world superpower once again, and he doesn't care what the cost is going to be. If this does balloon out of control, spiral out of control, it will be against the best interests of both the Russian Federation and these United States of America. And unless and until we are ready, willing, and able to send a strong, unresounding message, and in no uncertain terms, to Russia and Syria alike, these problems are going to be conflated. They are going to continue to increase in occurrence and in their danger. Therefore, we must not take this lightly. We must stop the calls to prematurely improve relations with Russia without Russia willing to give a damn bit back to us. Again, if Trump is half the negotiator that he claims to be, it is time to put our foot down. It is time to say enough is enough, that this is unacceptable and will not be tolerated by the United States nor by our coalition partners and allied forces within that destabilized region of the world. This is the strong stance that is necessary. This is the only way that we can protect our national security interests and our foreign policy interests within the region. Of course, that's far easier said than done. We are attempting to re-strengthen ourselves after the two failed terms of the Barack Hussein Obama regime, but this is that test that my first officer, Jeremy Grapington, and I mentioned, and we were really trying to work through that this would be a challenge, that President Trump would face a challenge from Russia. But that challenge is not going to easily be overcome if we as a nation and people do not have a clear, resolute position. But as I see it right now, there is no clear message. There is no clear diplomatic position of these United States of America. And with the Russian scandal continuing here within the confines of these United States of America, that is going to be a destabilizing distraction. Again, this is something that we can ill afford to allow to come to fruition, particularly at this turbulent juncture of our nation's relatively brief yet illustrious history here on the face of God's green earth. I wish that this wasn't the case, but again, when we examine this under the totality of the circumstances and with a modicum of objectivity, what other conclusion, what other inexorable conclusion can we reach with a straight face? Again, Russia's interests do not coincide with that of the United States. At this point, and particularly given that statement by the Russian ministry, that should be an open and obvious fact. It should be an unquestionable fact. Yet I fear that there are still going to be those within the borders of these United States of America who are saying that this is nothing but fake news, or that this is some other thing, and that we should still look upon Russia in a favorable light. I don't understand that. I don't understand how that can play out in our best interest. I don't understand how that has any connotation with America's national security interests or our geopolitical interests in the region. The fact of the matter is, it simply does not. But these forces are determined to double down on their narrative. They've gotten this far, and they think that if we do go down this path, and if we just would strengthen our relations with Russia, that somehow that would magically improve our standing throughout the globe. Yet I believe that nothing could be further from the truth. We were supposed allies of Russia at the, at the heat and peak of those dark and twisted days of the Second World War. But at that time, Russia was spying on us. Russia was already assuming a position of hostility, and the dominoes were being set up for the conflagration known as the Cold War, a conflict that caused the world to teeter at the edge of nuclear holocaust for a period of damn near a half century. You see, we cannot ignore these facts. These facts are there. They are open and obvious and are as clear as day to anyone who is willing to look at this with a modicum of objectivity and under the totality of the circumstances. These heightened tensions between Russia and the United States involving the Islamofascist state should, for once and for all, beyond a shadow of the doubt, prove that Russia's so-called common and shared interest against the Islamofascist state is a ruse. It is something that is not based in reality. It is something that is not going to come to fruition, and it behooves us to acknowledge that. Because what we must do is look out for our interests. No one else is going to look out for the interests of the United States other than the United States of America herself. That's the way it's always been. And that is not going to change. Unfortunately, this all coincides with another thing. In Great Britain, there has been yet another attack, although this one occurred outside of a mosque. It was a van that had run over people. It was a similar style attack to what we had seen with the Islamofascist barbarians before, but what was it? Was it the Islamofascists again? Well, we know that authorities in Britain have launched an investigation of this van attack in London, and they're treating it as terrorism. According to the New York Times, the authorities in Britain said on Monday that they were treating an early morning attack near a mosque in London as an act of terrorism directed towards Muslims. So what is this? I don't believe it was an act of terrorism necessarily against Muslims. It was certainly a response to the terrorist attacks that have been carried out and perpetrated by Muslims against the British subjects and citizens. But you see, this is the kind of confused narrative, message, and agenda that is weakening the position of the West. Western culture and civilization is under a direct threat, and it is unfurling with chaos and instability, just as the agent provocateurs of tyranny, despotism, but above all oppression, have always wanted it to. If we continue down this path, it will be a suicide pact for the cradle of Western civilization, for all that we hold near and dear. We can ill afford to see this become a new established norm. It is past time that we do start standing up for our interests, that we do recognize the threat that exists. And this was amid fears of retaliation for several recent assaults in the country attributed to Islamic extremists. Now, again, I don't like that phrase. Let's call them Islamofascists. Apparently, shortly after midnight, a van rammed into a group of pedestrians near the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London, and the imam of a nearby community center was credited with preventing an angry mob from attacking the driver after worshippers subdued him. Oh. So they would respond with violence, whereas we in the West don't. See, we cannot ignore